In the spring of 1863, a man walked into a Union Army camp in Tennessee carrying nothing but a canteen and a pocket watch that didn't belong to him. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a spy. And yet, within months, he would become one of the most valuable assets the Union possessed in the Western theater of the Civil War. His name was William Durks, and almost no one remembers him today. The American Civil War produced countless stories of heroism, sacrifice, and tragedy. We remember the generals, the presidents, the great battles that turned the tide of history. But tucked away in the margins of official records, in fading letters and forgotten pension files, are stories that never made it into the textbooks. Stories of people who changed the course of events without ever firing a shot or commanding a regiment. William Durks was born enslaved in Tennessee sometime around 1838. The exact date isn't recorded because his birth wasn't considered important enough to document. He grew up on a bough plantation near Nashville, learning to read in secret despite laws that made teaching enslaved people illegal. By the time he was a young man, he had developed skills that would have seemed unremarkable in freedom, but were extraordinary in bondage. He could read maps. He understood terrain. He had an almost photographic memory for landscape and distance. When the war began in 1861, Tennessee became a battleground. The state was divided, with Confederate sympathizers in the east and west, and Union support concentrated in the middle and mountainous regions. Nashville fell to Union forces in February 1862, making it the first Confederate state capital to be captured. But holding territory and understanding it were two very different things. The Union Army faced a persistent problem throughout the war. They were fighting in unfamiliar territory, navigating landscapes they didn't understand, relying on maps that were often outdated or simply wrong. Confederate forces had the advantage of local knowledge. They knew which roads flooded in spring, which passes through the mountains could accommodate artillery, which river crossings were fordable in summer but impassable in winter. This is where men like William Durks became invaluable. When he appeared at that Union camp in 1863, Durks didn't arrive as a refugee seeking protection. He arrived with information. He knew the locations of Confederate supply depots. He knew which roads the Confederates used to move troops at night. He knew where cavalry units were stationed and how many men they numbered. Within days, officers were calling him into planning sessions, asking him to verify intelligence reports, requesting his assessment of proposed routes for upcoming operations. But Durks didn't stop at providing information from memory. He began scouting actively behind Confederate lines, a task that required extraordinary courage and almost supernatural composure. He would slip out of Union camps at dusk and return before dawn, with details about enemy positions, troop movements, and defensive preparations. He did this not once or twice, but repeatedly over the course of months. The records don't tell us much about how Durks felt during these missions. There are no diaries, no personal letters that survived. What we have are dry military reports that mention him only in passing, almost as an afterthought. Information provided by colored scout William Durks proved accurate. Scout Durks confirmed enemy strength at 1,500 men. The language is bureaucratic, clinical, stripped of emotion, but imagine what those missions required. Durks was moving through territory controlled by an army fighting to preserve slavery. If captured, he wouldn't be treated as a prisoner of war. He would be considered a fugitive slave, subject to immediate execution or return to bondage under conditions far worse than what he'd escaped. Every time he crossed into Confederate territory, he was gambling his life on his ability to move unseen, to talk his way past sentries, to convincingly play whatever role the situation demanded. And he was doing this for an army that, at least in the early years of the war, wasn't even officially fighting to end slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't take effect until January 1863, and even then, it only applied to states in rebellion. The Union Army was fighting primarily to preserve the nation, not to abolish slavery. Many Union soldiers, particularly early in the war, had no interest in black freedom and resented the idea of fighting for that cause. Yet, here was William Durks, risking everything to support their military objectives. By the summer of 1863, Durks had become such a trusted figure that he was assigned to work directly with cavalry units, conducting raids deep into Confederate territory. These weren't simple reconnaissance missions. They were complex operations requiring precise timing, intimate knowledge of terrain, and the ability to adapt when plans went wrong. One operation in particular would cement Durks's reputation and reveal just how far his abilities extended beyond simple scouting. In August 1863, Union Command received intelligence that a major Confederate supply convoy would be moving through southern Tennessee, carrying ammunition, medical supplies, and clothing desperately needed by Confederate forces preparing for fall campaigns. The convoy would be heavily guarded, moving along back roads to avoid Union patrols. Intercepting it would require knowing the exact route, the timing, and the strength of the escort. Durks volunteered to gather that information. He disappeared into Confederate territory for 3 days. When he returned, he brought more than just intelligence. He brought a plan. He had identified not only the convoy's route, but also a place where the road narrowed between two ridges, a perfect spot for an ambush. He had counted the guards, noted their armament, and observed their level of discipline. He had even identified which officers were commanding the escort and assessed their likely response to an attack. The raid was authorized, and Durks went along as a guide. Just before dawn on August 19th, Union cavalry struck the convoy exactly where Durks had predicted. The operation was over in less than 30 minutes. The Confederates, caught completely by surprise in terrain that favored the attackers, surrendered with minimal resistance. The Union forces captured the entire convoy, its guards, and several Confederate officers who were traveling with it. The official report credited the success to superior intelligence and expert guidance. It didn't mention William Durks by name. This wasn't unusual. Throughout the Civil War, Black Scouts, spies, and guides provided critical intelligence to Union forces, and their contributions were systematically minimized or erased from official records. When they were mentioned at all, it was often without names, reduced to phrases like a reliable, contraband, or a colored informant. The assumption seemed to be that their work, however valuable, didn't warrant the same recognition given to white soldiers performing similar duties. But Durks's commanding officers knew what he was worth. Internal correspondence reveals that by late 1863, multiple units were requesting his services. Generals who had worked with him wrote to superiors praising his reliability and judgment. In a military culture that rarely extended such praise to black personnel, this was extraordinary. Yet for all his success, Durks remained in an ambiguous position. He wasn't officially enlisted as a soldier. He couldn't be, at least not initially. Black men weren't allowed to serve in the Union Army until 1862, and even after that, they faced discrimination, lower pay, and the constant threat that if captured, they would be treated as insurrectionists rather than legitimate combatants. Durks existed in a strange liminal space. He was essential to military operations, but held no official rank. He was trusted with life and death decisions, but had no formal authority. He risked as much as any soldier on the battlefield, but received none of the recognition or protection that military service theoretically provided. And then, in the winter of 1864, something changed. By early 1864, the nature of the Civil War had shifted dramatically. What had begun as a conflict primarily about preserving the Union had evolved into a war explicitly about ending slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation had transformed the moral and political landscape. Black men were now serving in Union forces in significant numbers, and their performance in battle was beginning to challenge the racist assumptions that had dominated American military thinking for generations. William Durks was still operating as a scout, but the context of his work had changed. He was no longer just gathering intelligence for an army fighting to restore the old Union. He was contributing to a cause that, at least on paper, included his own liberation and that of millions of others still held in bondage. The records from this period show an increase in the complexity and danger of his assignments. In February 1864, he led a reconnaissance mission deep into Alabama. traveling nearly 200 miles behind Confederate lines. The objective was to assess whether Confederate forces were massing for a spring offensive and to identify potential targets for Union raids. Durks was gone for nearly 2 weeks. When he returned, he brought detailed information about Confederate troop dispositions, supply lines, and morale. He reported that Confederate forces were indeed preparing for offensive operations, but that they were hampered by severe shortages of food, ammunition, and horses. He identified several vulnerable supply depots and suggested that disrupting them would cripple Confederate plans more effectively than engaging their armies directly. His recommendations were followed. Over the next several months, Union forces conducted a series of raids targeting the supply infrastructure Durks had identified. The operations were successful enough that Confederate commanders began to suspect they had a significant intelligence leak. Internal Confederate correspondence from this period shows increasing paranoia about spies and informants. They never identified Durks specifically, but they knew someone was feeding detailed, accurate information to Union forces. The danger to Durks increased exponentially. Confederate counterintelligence efforts intensified. Patrols were reinforced. Suspected informants were interrogated and sometimes executed as examples. Durks was operating in an environment where a single mistake, a single moment of bad luck, could mean capture and death. And yet he kept going. There's something both admirable and heartbreaking about this. Durks had every reason to stop, to accept a safer role, to let someone else take the risks. But he didn't. The records suggest he felt a sense of obligation, not just to the Union cause, but to the people still enslaved. Every piece of intelligence he gathered, every Confederate operation he disrupted, brought the end of the war closer. And the end of the war meant freedom. In June 1864, Durks was assigned to work with Untold, a Union colonel named Thomas Morgan, who was planning a cavalry raid into Mississippi. The objective was to destroy railroad infrastructure connecting Confederate supply networks. It was an ambitious operation requiring speed, precision, and perfect intelligence about Confederate defenses. Morgan requested Durks specifically. He had worked with him before and trusted his judgment. Durks spent 3 weeks scouting the target area, mapping railroad lines, identifying guard posts, and assessing the strength of Confederate forces in the region. He returned with a plan so detailed that Morgan reportedly said it was better than anything his own officers could have produced. The raid was launched in early July. Durks rode with the lead elements, guiding them through terrain he had memorized during his reconnaissance. The operation succeeded beyond expectations. Union forces destroyed more than 40 miles of railroad track, burned 3 supply depots, and captured a Confederate munitions train. They did all this while suffering minimal casualties, largely because Durks had guided them around major Confederate positions. Colonel Morgan wrote a letter to his superiors after the raid, explicitly crediting Durks and recommending that he be officially recognized for his service. The letter still exists in the National Archives. In it, Morgan writes that Durks has rendered services of inestimable value to this command, and that no white scout in this department has shown greater courage or provided more reliable intelligence. It's a remarkable document, not just for what it says about Durks, but for what it reveals about Morgan. In 1864, for a white Union officer to publicly advocate for recognition of a black scout was unusual. It suggests that Durks's contributions were so undeniable that they overcame the racial prejudices that normally prevented such acknowledgement. But the recognition Morgan requested never came. There's no evidence that Durks received any official commendation or award during the war. His name doesn't appear on any rolls of honor. He remained, in the eyes of the military bureaucracy, an informal asset rather than a formal member of the armed forces. By the fall of 1864, the war was entering its final phase. Sherman's march through Georgia was underway. Grant was grinding down Lee's army in Virginia. The Confederacy was collapsing, but it was collapsing slowly, and thousands more would die before it finally surrendered. Durks continued his work through this period, but the records become sparser. There are gaps of weeks, sometimes months, where he doesn't appear in official correspondence. It's unclear whether this means he was operating under such deep cover that his activities weren't being documented, or whether he had pulled back from frontline scouting to take on other roles. What we do know is that he survived. He was still alive when the war ended in April 1865. He was still alive when the 13th Amendment abolished slavery in December of that year. He had made it through one of the most dangerous roles any person could have held during the Civil War. And then he disappeared from the historical record. For years, there was nothing. No census records, no pension applications, no letters, no obituaries. It was as if William Durks had simply ceased to exist the moment the war ended. Historians who later became interested in his story searched for traces of his post-war life and found almost nothing. This wasn't unusual for Black veterans of the Civil War, especially those who had served in irregular capacities like scouting or spying. Many were illiterate or semi-literate, which meant they left few written records. Many moved frequently after the war, making them difficult to track through census data. Many were excluded from veteran organizations and received little or no support from the government they had served. But in Durks's case, the silence was particularly frustrating because his wartime service had been so significant. Here was a man who had risked his life repeatedly, who had contributed to major military successes, who had been praised by the officers who worked with him. And yet, he vanished. It wasn't until the 1890s that he reappeared, and when he did, it was in the most mundane way possible: a pension application. In 1892, Congress passed legislation that allowed certain civilians who had served the Union during the Civil War to apply for pensions. This included scouts and spies who had worked in unofficial capacities. William Durks, now in his mid-50s and living in poverty in Nashville, filed an application. The application itself is a small, bureaucratic document filled with the standard questions about dates of service, names of commanding officers, and descriptions of duties performed. But reading it today, knowing what we know about what Durks actually did, the contrast between the dry language of the form and the reality of his experiences is almost painful. Describe your service to the United States during the War of Rebellion. Durks's answer, written in a careful hand that suggests he had someone help him with the paperwork, reads, "Served as scout and guide for Union forces in Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi from 1863 to 1865. Provided intelligence on enemy positions and movements, guided cavalry units on raids behind enemy lines." That's it. 35 words to summarize years of work that had contributed to some of the Union's most successful operations in the Western Theater. The pension application required sworn statements from former officers who could verify his service. Durks managed to track down 2 men who had worked with him during the war. Both provided statements confirming his contributions. One of them, a former captain named James Wheeler, wrote that Durks had performed services of great value at considerable personal risk, and that his intelligence was always accurate and his courage beyond question. The application was approved. William Durks was granted a pension of $8 per month. $8. For comparison, Union soldiers who had served in combat roles were receiving pensions of $12 to $30 per month, depending on their rank and the severity of any injuries they had sustained. Durks, who had risked as much as any combat soldier and whose work had directly contributed to Union victories, received a pension that barely covered basic living expenses. But at least it was something. At least there was now an official acknowledgement, however minimal, that he had served. His name was in the records. His contributions were documented, even if they were drastically undervalued. Durks lived on that small pension for another decade. He never married, at least not that any records show. He had no children. He worked odd jobs when his health permitted, but by the early 1900s, he was increasingly frail. He died in 1904 in a rented room in Nashville, alone. There was no funeral notice in the newspapers, no obituary celebrating his service or mourning his passing. He was buried in an unmarked grave in a cemetery for Black residents on the outskirts of the city, and that might have been the end of the story, the final disappearance of William Durks from history, except for one small detail. That pocket watch he'd been carrying when he first walked into the Union camp in 1863 the one that didn't belong to him. It turned up again more than a century later in a way that would finally bring his story back to light. In 2008, a historical society in Tennessee received a donation from the estate of a woman who had died at the age of 97. Among her possessions was a Confederate officer's pocket watch engraved with a name and a date. The name was Captain Robert Morrison. The date was April 1863. The watch itself wasn't particularly valuable, but it was well preserved, and the Historical Society cataloged it along with the rest of the donation. It sat in storage for several years, one item among thousands, until a volunteer researcher named Patricia Coleman decided to investigate its provenance. Coleman started with the name, Captain Robert Morrison, Confederate Army. Records showed that Morrison had served in a Tennessee cavalry unit and had been captured by Union forces in August 1863 during a raid on a supply convoy. He survived the war and returned to Tennessee, where he lived until his death in 1889. But the watch had been dated April 1863, 4 months before Morrison was captured. So, how had it ended up in the possession of a woman who had died in 2008? Coleman dug deeper. She found that the woman who had owned the watch was descended from a family that had lived in Nashville continuously since before the Civil War. She traced the family line back and discovered something interesting. In the 1890s, one member of that family had rented rooms to boarders, and one of those boarders, according to city directories from the period, had been a black man named William Durks. The connection was circumstantial, but it was enough to make Coleman curious. She began searching for information about William Durks. What she found, scattered across pension records, military correspondence, and forgotten reports, was the story of a scout whose contributions to the Union war effort had been systematically overlooked. And there, in Colonel Thomas Morgan's report on the raid that had captured Captain Morrison, was a detail that made everything click into place. The raid had been guided by a scout who had provided the intelligence that made the ambush possible. The scout's name wasn't mentioned in the official report, but in Morgan's personal papers, preserved by his descendants and later donated to a historical archive, there was a letter where he referred specifically to the colored scout Durks and his invaluable service during the operation. William Durks had been there when Captain Morrison was captured, and at some point, either during the raid or afterward, Morrison's pocket watch had come into Durks's possession. We don't know exactly how. Maybe Durks took it as a souvenir. Maybe Morrison gave it to him, a gesture of respect from one man who had risked everything to another. Maybe it was simply found among the captured supplies, and Durks claimed it. The watch itself offers no answers. But what we do know is that Durks kept it. Through the rest of the war, through the difficult years of Reconstruction, through decades of poverty and marginalization, he held on to that watch. And when he died, it passed to the family he had boarded with, probably in lieu of unpaid rent or as a token of gratitude for their care in his final years. The watch became a thread that allowed historians to pull at the edges of a forgotten story. Patricia Coleman published her findings in a small historical journal in 2011. Her article caught the attention of other researchers interested in Black contributions to the Civil War, a field that had been growing since the 1990s as scholars worked to recover the stories of African Americans whose service had been erased or minimized. Over the next few years, a more complete picture of William Durks began to emerge. Researchers combed through military records, pension files, and private papers. They found references to him in places that earlier historians had overlooked or dismissed. They discovered that he had worked with at least 8 different Union commanders and had participated in more than 40 intelligence-gathering missions behind Confederate lines. They found that he had been wounded at least once, shot in the shoulder during a skirmish while guiding a cavalry unit through enemy territory. The wound wasn't serious enough to end his service, but it troubled him for the rest of his life, contributing to the health problems that eventually left him unable to work. They found letters from officers who had worked with him buried in archives where he was described as fearless, reliable, and possessed of extraordinary judgment. One officer wrote that Durks had a better understanding of Confederate movements in this theater than any man in our intelligence service, white or colored. And they found something else, something that perhaps reveals more about William Durks than any military report ever could. In his pension file, there was a brief statement explaining why he had waited nearly 30 years after the war to apply for benefits. He had been illiterate at the end of the war, the statement said, and hadn't known that he was eligible for a pension. He had only learned about the possibility in the 1890s when a former Union officer he happened to encounter in Nashville told him about the new legislation. The officer had helped him file the paperwork. For 3 decades, William Durks had been entitled to recognition and support for his service, and he hadn't even known it. He had simply continued living, working when he could, surviving on the margins of a society that had no interest in honoring what he had done. In 2019, the Tennessee Historical Commission voted to place a marker at the cemetery where Durks was buried. The marker identifies him as a Union scout and honors his courage and service to the cause of freedom. It's a small thing, a bronze plaque in a quiet cemetery, but it's more than he had for a century after his death. Historians now recognize William Durks as one of the most effective intelligence operatives in the Western theater of the Civil War. His work contributed to dozens of successful Union operations and helped shorten the war, saving countless lives in the process. He did this work without the protection of official military status, without the prospect of recognition or reward, and at constant risk of capture and execution. He was one of thousands of Black Scouts, spies, and guides who served the Union during the Civil War, most of whom remain nameless in the historical record. Their contributions were essential to Union victory, yet they were systematically written out of the story, reduced to footnotes, or erased entirely. William Durks was lucky in one respect. A pocket watch, a curious researcher, and a trail of documents just substantial enough to follow brought his story back from oblivion. But how many others like him are gone completely, their names lost, their courage forgotten, their sacrifices unacknowledged? The history we inherit is often less about what actually happened than about whose stories were deemed worth preserving. For a very long time, the stories of Black Americans who shaped the course of the Civil War were not considered worth preserving. They were inconvenient to narratives that celebrated white heroism or sought to reconcile North and South at the expense of the truth. William Durks walked into a Union camp in 1863, carrying nothing but a canteen and a stolen watch, and he changed the course of the war. He risked his life repeatedly for a cause that would eventually grant him freedom, but would never grant him the recognition he deserved. He lived and died in poverty, forgotten by the government he had served and the history that should have honored him. The watch that survived him became, by accident, a key to unlock his story. But how many other stories are still locked away, waiting for some chance discovery to bring them to light? If you enjoy uncovering stories history left behind, consider subscribing to Lost and True.